Perhaps no image so powerfully encapsulates the nascent 47th presidency of the United States. Rows of seated billionaires, the wealthiest incoming cabinet in U.S. history, formally ushered into power. The combined personal worth, not the market value of the stock of the companies they lead. I'm talking about the actual personal net worth of the billionaires seen in this image is estimated to be nearly $1 trillion, according to Forbes. The message seems to be, welcome to the new American oligarchy. This billionaire flex is a stark and damning illustration of the role that extreme wealth plays in Donald Trump's orbit. But understanding how we got here and how to rise from it requires us to zoom out from this image and this moment. President Trump is the inevitable outcome of forces that were set in motion some 50 years ago, maybe even longer. His ascendancy marks the apex of laissez-faire economics, a philosophy that argues for minimal government intervention in the economy, what we think of as the free and largely unregulated market system. That, combined with pivotal Supreme Court rulings that lifted sensible restraints on corporate political spending. Together, these forces set America on a path toward oligarchy. Trump recognized the brokenness of our system and then moved in to capitalize on it. Investopedia defines an oligarch as a person of a, quote, ruling class of individuals who amassed great wealth or status and who exert power over the highest government circles. Starting in 1976, the Supreme Court's landmark decision in the campaign finance case Buckley v. Valeo unleashed a torrent of political spending by wealthy individuals. In that case, the High Court determined that limits on election spending were unconstitutional, opening the door for the ultra-rich to spend as much as they want on their own campaigns. 34 years later, the Supreme Court would go one step further in Citizens United, granting corporations First Amendment rights, meaning that their political spending was protected as a form of free speech, essentially opening the door to unlimited election spending. With a single ruling, the Supreme Court dismantled over a century of federal restrictions designed to shield our political systems from the corrupting influence of extreme wealth. The damage to our democratic institutions cannot be overstated. Dark money flooded our politics. Politicians became more beholden than they had been to moneyed interests than to their voters. A handful of unelected judges essentially gutted the fundamental principle of one person, one vote, forcing your individual vote to compete against billions of dollars from industries whose interests often conflict with those of the working and middle class. Meanwhile, a new economic philosophy emerged in the 1980s, one that prioritized free and unregulated markets, a seismic shift that would usher in historic levels of inequality. Deregulation across multiple administrations brought prosperity to the wealthiest, while the rest of America experienced stagnant or even declining incomes when you account for inflation. And that brings us to today. Today, just a tiny sliver of the country controls the overwhelming majority of wealth in this nation. According to a Congressional Budget Office report from October, the country's top 10% maintains a majority of the wealth in the United States. The top 1% controls nearly a third of it. What effect does control of the moneyed class over politics have on us? Well, today, the word care in American healthcare has been stripped of all compassion, with insurance companies routinely putting profits over people. According to an FTC report from last week, some of the nation's largest health insurance companies profited from prescription price hikes of 1,000% or more. Today, health insurers interrupt doctors in the middle of surgery to question their patients' coverage, as a Texas physician detailed in an Instagram video earlier this month. Today, so-called food barons dominate our food industry, where just a handful of mega corporations control every link of the food supply chain, as an investigation by The Guardian and Food and Water Watch revealed in 2021. Today, a monopoly of home builders is worsening the housing shortage in the United States, pushing home ownership further out of reach for the average American. According to the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis, tackling America's housing crisis will require taking on these monopolies. Decades of laissez-faire policies have completely shattered the American dream for the nation's working and middle class. Oxfam America puts it bluntly. Today, the top 0.01% and giant corporations have rigged the rules so drastically that some billionaires end up paying 0% in taxes, nothing. Instead, working families are bearing more than their fair share of the tax burden. As a result of all of this, 46% of America's middle class say they have no choice but to scale back or suspend their retirement plans, according to a Primerica report, and now need to rely on staying healthy enough to work more years than they had initially planned. Those economic forces, combined with key Supreme Court rulings, have collectively laid the groundwork for the seismic shift in power that we are witnessing today. Notably, today's equivalent of the robber barons not only control vast streams of wealth and production, but also the flow of information, possibly making them an even greater threat to our democratic institutions and public welfare. The tech industrial complex, as Biden called it, now seems to function as an unofficial propaganda arm of the Trump administration, cloaking its actions in the language of economic populism and even democratic rights, as the oligarchy prepares to strip America for its parts. Mark Zuckerberg, for instance, frames crucial and much-needed regulation of the tech industry as an infringement of the constitutional right to free speech. As our nation enters this new chapter, we at Velshi remain committed to providing you with clarity amid the smokescreens of deception and holding to account the tech industrial complex that now occupies the halls of American power. We will closely track these threats to our democratic institutions and to America's working and middle class, these threats to you and your livelihood and your prosperity, and we will hold those who are using their economic power to undermine yours to account. Everybody uses the word oligarchy now, but what we are seeing is its manifestation. We are seeing the ways in which the powerful make decisions without shame that influence policies that affect the prosperity of the average American.
Absolutely. The book was published 4 years ago, by the way, and not much has changed. It's gotten worse. What's interesting, Ali, is that starting in 71 with the Powell memo, which really kicked this off, and then, of course, the Reagan Revolution. But, as you mentioned, the Supreme Court in 86 ruling that money isn't actually money, it's actually speech, and therefore it's protected by the First Amendment when it's given to politicians. And then Lewis Powell himself, 2 years later in 78, authoring the Bellotti decision. That was an entirely Republican appointee decision, as was Citizens United. I think it's important to note that these are entirely Republican efforts, that the consequence of all this has been that the Democratic Party has been focusing on elections. They've been focusing on Congress and the White House. And the Republican Party has been focusing on the courts and on the media, buying up media like there's no tomorrow, and packing the courts, realizing that if you control the courts and the media, you can control the elections, and then thus the elected bodies. And that's pretty much where we are right now. This is the second time we've seen this in America. The first time was in the period from the 1830s to the 1860s in the Old South, where a group of plantation owners, as a result of a technological innovation, the kind of the tech bros of their time, started using this device called a cotton gin. Eli Whitney had invented in 1789. And it could do the work of 50 people. And so a small number of very large plantations were able to just wipe out all of their competitors over this 20, 30-year period, and ended up ruling the South with an absolute iron fist, ending democracy, controlling the courts, and controlling all the newspapers. Any newspaper publisher who took them on could find himself hanged. And, we ended up fighting a civil war over that little brush with oligarchy.
We've gotten to an interesting place. The entrepreneur and venture capitalist and billionaire Nick Hanauer, who's a sort of an activist, has recently explained how the wealthy deploy propaganda to justify this consolidation of power. And he talks about a specific refrain that we've often heard from the corporate sector. He says, the one thing I've come up against so many times in my career working on economic policy is it's a job killer. How many times have you heard that? If you raise taxes on the rich, it'll kill jobs. If you regulate big corporations, it'll kill jobs. If you raise wages for working people, it'll kill jobs. We live in a world that is turned so upside down by this market fundamentalist framework that anything you propose that will improve the lives of middle class or working people has to affirmatively prove that it will do no harm. But anything good that happens to the truly rich is an unalloyed good. So infinite bonuses on Wall Street are a sign of economic growth and success, but a tiny increase in the minimum wage is a very dangerous job killer. I mean, that's become the reality of the discourse these days, Tom.
Yeah, and Nick is a good guy, you know, in his participation with patriotic millionaires, but it's absolutely the case. And which another book I wrote, The Hidden History of American Monopoly. What we've seen since Reagan in 1983 essentially directed the Federal Trade Commission, the Securities and Exchange Commission, and the Department of Justice to dial back on their enforcement of the antitrust laws. You know, we had kind of during the Industrial Revolution, the 1870s, 80s, 90s. Senator Sherman of Ohio introduced the Sherman Antitrust Act, and that was passed in 1881, as I recall. But it really didn't get enforced until Teddy Roosevelt became president in 1901. And you know, the consequence of Reagan, and for all that time, from then until the Reagan Revolution, we were actually enforcing the antitrust laws. There were two other ones, the Clayton Antitrust Act in 27 and one in 56. And the result, and in fact, the Supreme Court in 1965 ruled that it was illegal for Buster Brown and Kinney Shoes to join because the resulting company would control 5% of the shoe market.
5%.
Today, just Nike controls 19%. Yeah. I mean, so what we're seeing is just this absolute seizure of American business by these giant monopolies. It's massive.
We're going to keep talking about this, Thom, because right now we had a hot minute where we were actually enforcing laws on the books, not bringing in new regulations, but doing what we said under the Biden administration. Lena Khan and the Federal Trade Commission gone now. And so whatever you didn't like that was going on in terms of consolidation, we're going to see more of in the next few years. But you and I will keep talking about it.